They called him El Commandant, a man who stood up to the most powerful nation on earth and refused to kneel. For over 5 decades, he ruled Cuba, outlasting 10 American presidents, hundreds of assassination attempts, and the fall of the Soviet Union. To his followers, he was a revolutionary hero who freed his people from corruption and foreign control. To his enemies, he was a dictator, a man who silenced opposition and held on to power with iron fists. But behind the beard, the uniform, and the fierce speech was a boy from a sugar plantation shaped by poverty, pride, and rebellion. Before the world knew Fidel Castro, there was just Fidel, the restless boy who refused to obey. This is the untold story of how a farm boy from eastern Cuba became the revolutionary who defied an empire. This is Fidel Castro, the boy who became a revolution. Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruiz was born on August 13, 1926 in Bahrain, a small village in eastern Cuba. His father, Angel Castro, was a wealthy Spanish immigrant who owned a sugar plantation. His mother, Lina Ross, was a domestic servant in Angel's house. Even as a child, Fidel's life was full of contradictions. Born into wealth, but surrounded by poverty, raised in privilege, yet burning with anger at injustice. He was sent to Jesuit boarding schools where he learned discipline, faith, and an unbreakable will. Teachers often describe him as intelligent, rebellious, and stubborn, a boy who always challenged authority. At the University of Havana, Fidel studied law, but more importantly, he discovered politics. He was drawn to the struggles of the poor and the corruption of Cuban leaders who were loyal to the United States rather than their own people. By the 1950s, Cuba was controlled by Fulgencio Batista, a US-backed dictator who allowed American corporations and the mafia to dominate the island. Fidel believed that Cuba needed a revolution, and in 1953, he led an armed attack on the Moncada barracks, hoping to spark an uprising. The attack failed. Many of his followers were killed, and Fidel was arrested. During his trial, he gave a speech that became legendary. "Condemn me, it doesn't matter. History will absolve me." He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but was released after only 2. Soon after, he went into exile in Mexico, where he met Ernesto Guevara, the Argentinian doctor who shared his revolutionary dream. Together, they trained a small group of fighters, and in 1956, they sailed back to Cuba on a tiny boat called Granma. Only a handful survived the landing, but from those survivors grew a guerrilla army that would change history. For the next 2 years, Castro's rebel fought Batista's force in the Sierra Maestra mountain. They were outnumbered, under-equipped, and constantly hunted, but Fidel's charisma, discipline, and message of justice inspired the people. By January 1, 1959, Batista fled the country. Fidel Castro marched into Havana, victorious. Crowds filled the streets shouting "Viva Fidel!" At first, many hoped he would restore democracy, but Castro had other plans. He began transforming Cuba into a socialist state, redistributing land, nationalizing business, and challenging the power of the wealthy elite. To some, he was a savior. To others, a dictator in the making. After overthrowing Batista, Fidel promised to free Cuba from foreign control, but there was one nation that wouldn't let go: the United States. For decades, US companies had owned most of Cuba's sugar plantation, banks, and industries. So when Fidel nationalized these properties, Washington retaliated. In 1960, the US cut off trade, banned exports to Cuba, and began plotting to remove Fidel from power. Then, in April 1961, came the Bay of Pigs invasion, a CIA-backed attempt to overthrow him. Hundreds of exiles trained by the US landed on Cuba's southern coast, expecting the people to join them. Instead, Castro's army crushed them in just 3 days. It was one of the biggest humiliations in the US history, and it made Fidel Castro a symbol of resistance across Latin America. But he knew America wouldn't stop. So, he turned to a new friend, the Soviet Union. In 1962, Fidel struck a secret deal with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. The Soviets would send nuclear missiles to Cuba, only 90 miles from the United States, to deter another invasion. When US spy planes discovered the missile, the world stood on the edge of nuclear war. For 13 tense days, the fate of humanity hung in the balance. President John F. Kennedy demanded the missiles be removed, while Fidel urged the Soviets to hold firm, even if it meant war. Eventually, Nikita agreed to withdraw the missiles without consulting Fidel. Castro felt betrayed, realizing even his allies saw Cuba as a pawn in the Cold War. But still, the Soviet Union became Cuba's lifeline, sending oil, food, and weapons in exchange for sugar and loyalty. When the USSR collapsed in 1991, Cuba was left isolated and starving, but Fidel refused to surrender. Fidel Castro survived over 600 assassination attempts, countless plots, and decades of US embargoes. He built schools and hospitals, raised literacy rates, and gave Cuba one of the longest life expectancies in Latin America, but at a cost. Freedom of speech, free election, and political opposition were crushed. To some, he was a visionary, to others, a tyrant, but no one could deny his impact. In 2008, Inez forced him to hand power to his brother Raul Castro, and on November 25, 2016, Fidel Castro, the boy who became a revolution, died at age 90. He defied empires, inspired generations, and left behind a legacy as controversial as it is unforgettable. Love him or hate him, Fidel Castro's story reminds us that one man's revolution can change the course of history.